the funniest thing I remember then was trying to explain to my parents and to friends what the hell I was doing. And I was like, we are basically pirate radio on the internet. And they're like, oh, that's cute. They're like, oh, that's cute. Like, oh, you just talked to a few people. And then in 2012, I was like, yeah, we hit like 20,000 downloads in 1 month. And that's without streaming. Like we did not, like right. YouTube didn't allow it. There was no streaming. Yeah, YouTube didn't allow that quite yet.
There was probably not like Spotify at that point where people get in their cars and push play. Like you had to actually play.
You would have to find some weird, crazy third-party workaround. I mean, there was a Ghost Heads podcast that was they were crushing it with the Ghostbuster fans, and they were doing their own thing with their hosting, and then we came out, and then of course, like it was like, okay, time to start the late night talk show wars between the two, which was absolute bonkers. And Brendan went all in on it and became more Andy Kaufman-esque with his approach to promoting the show. So there was a made-up rivalry between the two, which was very much Jay Leno, Conan O'Brien at the time. And I unfortunately had to kind of smooth things over in between. AJ infamously banned me and Brendan at one point from Ghostbuster fans, which is great. And then, of course, that all just disappeared. And then we were, I guess, allowed back, ? So no, it was a lot of fun because that was it. It was like our approach was like, this is like a pirate radio show where we get to talk about Ghostbusters. But then what gave it such crazy validity was we got Dan Aykroyd and Ernie Hudson in the first month. And when I first met Brendan, it was at a Ghostbusters 35 millimeter screening at the Mayfair Theater in Ottawa on Mother's Day. I'll never forget this because he was wearing a corduroy suit jacket and a Ghostbusters button, like a 1984, like the same button that Dan Aykroyd wore on the Johnny Carson show. He found something like that, like a replica. And we saw the movie and it was great. That's how I met him. And that's where Outstreams Radio was born, because it's completely out of sync. So I was like, I know what print this is. This is amazing. So I've had amazing experiences at the Mayfair Theater in Ottawa with the Ghostbusters 35 millimeter print. And thanks to that screening, Cross the Streams Radio was born, because that's how I met Brendan. And then he literally said, I just recorded a pilot episode for Cross the Streams. Do you want to co-host? And that's how I met him. And that's where I was like, yep, we're going to be fucking friends. Let's do this.
How do you get from there to Dan Aykroyd? Like, how does that happen? How do you go from being like, we're going to start a show to a month later, you're doing stuff with principal actors from this franchise?
So if memory serves me right, and I'm sure that there's archives on Facebook that exist, wherever I can probably dig up. But from what I remember, we did the screening, and then Brendan made me listen to the pilot episode, and it was funny. It had some cool skips and random commercial breaks. So the whole thing was supposed to be like a Conan O'Brien kind of style late night talk show where we would have an interview segment and then we would cut to fake commercial breaks that we would get to invent. So we would have our own Saturday Night Live commercial parodies in the show. And so we would do that. And so in the midst of us editing some of the commercial parodies, Brendan started signing up for IMDb Pro back in 2009. And then all you needed was just an email address, everyone's agent, unrestricted. Boy, did they learn the hard way with that one. We immediately start talking with Dan's people, and they are all up near around Kingston, Ontario, maybe just outside of Toronto. And they're like, oh, well, he's going to be in Barrie, Ontario for a liquor signing for his wine and just before Crystal Light Vodka. So we're like, okay, that's 5 hours away. And we just did one episode of Cross Streams Radio. And I said, wouldn't it be funny if we just drove up and like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas interviewed him? And so we did the math, and it was like, okay, when is he doing the signing? Okay, 11 a.m. in Barrie, Ontario. So it's 5 hours away. well, we're not going to sleep, so let's just stay up all night, and then we'll drive at like 3 a.m, and we'll get to Barrie, Ontario, and we'll just bombard them with questions and meet them. You started, spitballing ideas for jokes, and on the way up, and Brendan's like, "Oh, we need to pull over. We need to collect jars of bees before we meet him." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He goes, "What? Well, we're going to reenact the scene from My Girl so that we can, release the bees at him." And then that way we can be like, "Hey, Dad, you remember the bees? Do you remember the bees, Dan?" So that was our writing. That was kind of like our writing phase. So that was kind of like how we would like come up with jokes. You got to remember, like I have like, I'm not necessarily like a stand-up comedian writer. I'm more of a wit when it comes to like sketch comedy. Whereas
sure.
Brendan was 100% performance, Andy Kaufman style. So we had those two. So like he would just go in guns blazing, and people would really think he was like, is this guy mentally off the spectrum, or is he like pulling our leg? And I was the guy who had to clean up and say, yes, he's pulling your leg. But then Brendan's like, no, don't listen to him. I'm not pulling your leg. I'm dead serious. And then it would just go back and forth like that. So we, needless to say, we did make it to Barrie without the bees. Brendan infamously made a remix of Paper Planes, that song Paper Planes, except with all Dan Aykroyd sound bites.
I'm Dan Aykroyd.
Get this doofus off my screen.
I have never heard this number.
I don't know if you can. I'll see if I can dig it up, but it's absolutely brilliant. Anyway, Brendan ripped a copy on CD and gave it to Dan, and he immediately passed it to his handler. So I don't think he ever listened to it. We were like Hunter S. Thompson winging it. And then all of a sudden, Ernie Hudson's agent messages us back when we got back to Ottawa. And it was like, is this really happening? Like it was crazy. And then sure enough, he gave all of the contact info, and then we coordinated the phone-in interview. So how it worked was we explained to Ernie's people that this would be a show. And that became the joke. We called ourselves Cross the Streams Radio because no one knew what a podcast was.
Right.
So it made more sense to say that this was a radio show, an internet radio show.